Everybody, what's going on? That was the worst, slowest moving excuse for a round of applause. Let's hear that again. How's it going, everybody? Okay, there we go. You guys, like me, were probably thrown off by the guy in the photo with the short hair. I'm looking at him down here. I don't know who that is. But I love seeing it in 3D. Let's get a quick round of applause for the Thinker crew who mocked up all these videos, all these images. You guys killed it, as always, every year. All right. We're going to talk for a little bit, and then we're going to go to lunch. But first of all, I need some of your guys' help. I just want to see something because I'm going to put you to work. All right, so throughout the course of this, I'm going to be asking for some help, and at the end of it, I'm going to give you guys a pretty specific call to action. So I'm just curious about the room. If you're in the room and you've worked with Think 3D in any capacity as far as what we do with organizations and culture, throw your hand up. Yeah. Thank you, one person. There's more than one. The reason I want you to see this is just look around you and all the stuff that we're going to talk today about accountability and culture and what that looks like. I'm going to be looking to some of you guys to lead the charge with some of these things. And if you're looking around and you see some of those people with their hands up and you're like, I wonder what that's all about, go ask them, because I want them to be able to explain it to you a little bit later on about what they're doing. But when we talk about vision and versions for Think 3D for us, this isn't a new concept necessarily, but the timing felt right when it came to putting this theme together. You see, we've visioned in a couple of different versions, obviously some throwback images there from CultureCon of years past. Earlier on in the business, when Tammy and Vonnie would take moody candids for their marketing promo stuff, right? Got the nice black and white photo. Or even our business model. Early on, we visioned in versions of what we thought this would be. Is it box sets of DVDs and books? Is it training material? Is it weekend retreats? Whatever the case is, we've evolved it. And even from the beginning when I first came on board, I think this was day 2 or 3. These are just children in that photo, those young men. We've versioned this thing. And like I said at the break, it's not always the version that we planned, but it's the version we've built with intention. And if you guys have worked with us, as so many of you guys did, and put your hands up, you know that we've shifted gears. We've provided different things as needs arose. Today, our services look different than they did when we started out. We are doing in-depth analysis, sometimes overhaul. We're doing coaching. We're doing one-on-ones. We're using surveys and tools and resources, as well as doing a lot of the stuff that we've done with group training to build cultures. And what's allowed us to vision and version successfully through all these needs has been our core belief, right? And this is going to be important because this is what I come back to, is our core beliefs. You see, we believe at Think 3D that we can better the world by improving people's lives, by improving the way that they work. We believe that we can better the world by improving people's lives, by improving the way that they work. And that belief is so fundamental and foundational to who we are that it has allowed us to version multiple iterations of how we go about doing that. And the reason why we believe this and the reason why that we do what we do is because when it comes to work and the world that we live in, we believe that there's a better way. And when I say there's a better way, I mean there's a better way to go about our work because it has such a significant impact on our lives. When you think about the amount of time you spend at work, it's on average about 115,000 hours for an average person. We do this study with people in group trainings. It's about 50 to 60% or more of your waking hours. Clifton recently did a study last year, and they surveyed people all over the world, globally, and asked them, do you have a best friend or do you have a support structure? And 25% of the people that they surveyed said, no, I'm alone. So we think about, one, we think there's a better way. We spend a massive amount of time at work. No other portion of your life consumes that much of your time, energy, and effort. And two, we know that loneliness is spreading. So we know there's a big opportunity with the way that people interact with work and the environment and the workplace there. We also know that just looking at the job market, and any of you who are in hiring or in people or in management know these things to be true. This isn't new data, but I looked it up just the other day. In the last 14 days, within a 25-mile radius of this zip code, there are 5,264 open jobs. Some of you probably have some of those open jobs in your organizations. How many of you have a line of people out the door? Yep. All right. And then what do we hear a lot of times about workforce today? People don't want to work. But if you look at the math, it's just not true. And so what we got to do is we got to start peeling back the layers. of what's going on with this, right? Even if we look at the unemployment numbers in the Sioux Falls area, so our county, we're at 1.7%. If every single person in that found a job in that 5,200 and some, there'd still be only about half of those jobs filled. So something's changing. We also know that turnover and retention are changing. BLS, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, just released their 2023 numbers. The average employee tenure is now only 4.1 years. When you look at that generationally, there's some differences, but this is changing, and it's changing rapidly, and I don't think it's going to slow down. Employees who are aged 25 to 34, where the majority of our new workforce is going to come from over the next few years, their average tenure is only 2.8 years. So think about it. We spend a majority of our time, energy, and effort at work. It has a massive impact on our quality of life. There's not a massive amount of available, qualified, engaged workforce, and we also know that our average working relationship with an employee might only be 3 years. So what does that mean? It's time to shift our mindset, is what it means. This is where I'm going to start talking about what I want us to build and what I want to be thinking about. My goal with these next few things and the next few stories I'm going to tell you is that you walk away with a plan or an idea with which you can start to revamp your culture based on this mindset shift and your beliefs. And I'm going to talk about why those things are pivotal to building this successful environment in the future. So first of all, it's going to take a significant and intentional mindset shift when we talk about culture and experience. Culture and experience for your teams can no longer be the sole responsibility or owned by one or two people. This isn't about bringing another executive to the table and saying, you are the culture person. This is about every person at the table adopting the mindset that if my area, my functional area, is not actively bought in to the sustaining, the holding up, and the deployment in intentional ways of the environment we're trying to build, it's not going to be successful. These are global initiatives. Many of you have heard us say that before, if you've worked with us in any capacity, that recruitment and retention are not HR initiatives alone, they are global initiatives. And that's one of the biggest shifts we have to make, is this shouldn't be a strategy to simply hire. This should be a strategy to completely shift the environment we're making, right? The next thing under that is we have to look at employment differently. We have to question the way we look at employment. You can see a lot of content out there about the gap between expectations of employees and employers. Well, employees want this, but employers aren't providing it. And then, employers are saying things like, well, people don't want to work. There's a gap there, and we have to reassess that relationship, otherwise this won't work. So when it comes to employment, I like to think of it as a partnership, not something obligatory or transactional. Because employees and employers want the same things. Employees want flexibility. Great. So do employers. We want flexibility too, because we might have to change our minds. We might have to make a different call. We might have to adjust the scope of something, and we want the flexibility to do so. Employees want autonomy and independence. Fantastic. So do employers. I want people who are going to solve problems independently. We want these same things. So we have to adjust the way we think about that working relationship in order to make that relationship better. And finally, the last thing, and this is going to be a through line of whatever it is you're doing with your culture. You have to start focusing on environments, not events. If you have worked with us, specifically with me in the last year, you've probably heard this before, but for those of you that are hearing this for the first time, I want you to think about it. Creating environments, not events. When you coach, when you train, when you develop values and systems, which we'll talk about in a second, I want you to be mindful of the environment it's creating. Coaching doesn't start when something happens. Training or retraining doesn't start when there's an opportunity or there's a miss. It is an environment we're building. And there's some really interesting numbers to back this up. For the sake of time, I'm going to go through a couple of ways that we define culture. First of all, we have to start with definitions. This is something we're big on. I really believe in defining things. The first thing that I want you to do is understand, when we talk about culture, I want you to think about your culture like an ecosystem, right? When we talk about an ecosystem, what I mean is every organism in that ecosystem is connected, and you cannot affect one without it affecting the others. Your culture is like an ecosystem. There is nothing you do. There is no decision, choice, or action that happens that is actually net zero to your culture. Every choice you make, it either contributes to or detracts from. And it might not be in massive ways, and it might be in slow-burning ways, but eventually there's not really anything you do that's completely net neutral. So we have to start thinking about our culture as an ecosystem. The other thing that I like to do is talk about what creates culture. In my opinion, and I get asked this a lot, Dan, what do you You talk about culture all the time. You do this for a living. What do you define as culture? And I define culture simply as our choices or our behaviors. If you were to take the aggregate of every choice that's made by every team member in your organization in a given day and add all those up, the net result is your culture. Right? Our culture is formed by our behaviors. And if our behaviors don't align with what we say our culture is, we need to go back to the drawing board and reassess. But our culture is developed by our behaviors. And this is where I get back to beliefs. What informs our behaviors? It's our beliefs. Right? You cannot have a strong culture without truly fleshing out what you believe in, what you believe to be true about the world, your role in it, and your work in it. Right? It's time to start thinking differently about how we deploy these things. So one of the first things we ask every group to do is you have to define your culture, your beliefs, the vision you have for it, the expectation you have for it working. Then, you need to communicate it clearly and often. Culture is something that should be a through line, not just deployed on a website, not just deployed on a poster. Those are great places to start. But what I mean is it in your training material? Is it evident in your systems? Is it evident in the partners you choose? Is it evident in the way you coach employees? Is it in your handbooks? Do you make decisions based on it? Is it functional, right? And we have to communicate that clearly and often. One of the biggest things I want you guys to consider as an organization, whether you work for yourself, you have a small team, or you lead a large team, are our beliefs driving our values? And are our values driving the way that we use, shape, and operate systems? And I'm talking like technical stuff, IT, onboarding, your process management, your coaching, your training, your performance management, your evals. Are our beliefs driving our values, and are our values driving those systems? We ask people a lot, and we've been doing it, and we've seen a lot of success where we ask them to revamp their systems and process so it aligns with the type of environment they want to make. This does no good to us if all we do is create a culture where we are talking about things in ideal senses. We have to make it functional. To give you guys a couple examples, because I'm a nerd, because I can, but there's one really interesting example. It's taken a long time, about 20 plus years. The new F-35s, and I say new, they've been out for a few years now, but if you guys have more time, I'm not going to go into this entire story. It's a very interesting project. But the F-35 JFP, or the Joint Fighter Project, cost $1.7 trillion. They had to hire a ton of people in a short amount of time. Talk about an onboarding nightmare. They had to go from 180 to 4,000. It's a really, really interesting read. But I happened upon a book and a couple of interviews of the guy who led this project, and there's a few key takeaways that I thought were really, really significant, and so I wanted to share them with you today because they're great examples of how you build a functional environment, all right? So first and foremost, massive defense project. There's one company that landed the contract, and they involved about 7 other entities, governments, countries, DODs involved, different companies, competing companies from other companies even. And the first thing they did is they said, we can't do this like we've always done it. We got to establish a new identity, and they did. You were no longer an employee of Lockheed. You were no longer an employee of Boeing. You were no longer an employee of BAE. You were an employee at the JFP, the Joint Fighter Program. You got a new badge, new handbook. Welcome to the team. Here's how we do it here. That was fairly unheard of at the time. The second thing they did, when they built that culture and they said, here's how they do it here, one of the first things they started doing was filling their teams differently. They went with the best athlete approach, which was instead of looking at how we would traditionally do this, meaning the lead organization fills all the lead spots, they assessed their team in every country with every other organization based on value and experience, were they the right person for the job, right? And we talk about that a lot. In a culture, everyone has equal value, so we have to assess things based on value, not position. One of the other things that I really liked that they did is they made their mentorship, apprenticeship, and coaching model 360. And this is a really cool way to bridge generational gaps. So they were dealing with employees and engineers, folks who were brilliant and experienced, who had 20 plus years under their belt, and new graduates just out of school. What do you do? How do you bridge that gap? They made training go both ways. You're a new employee, you're young, you just graduated college, got hired at Lockheed. Guess what? You got an older employee now you get matched up with. They train you on certain things that you wouldn't know, and you get the chance to train them on tech. Their mentorship went both ways, and the results were really, really positive. The other things they did, and I'm going to make this other one quick, what I mean by the woodshed, it says the woodshed up there, that's actually a room or a series of rooms they had at every site they established, and it was kind of a running joke, but it was their room for conflict, and feedback. And they made parameters on how they wanted conversations to go. They knew it was high-pressure work. They knew there'd be disagreements. They knew all of these things, so they created a space for it, and they created a method for it. They coached to a standard of how we want to disagree and how we want to handle conflict. And they created a space for it. And if we're not being that intentional with our environments, we're not going to have as much success. I'm going to move on to another example really quick in the similar vein of coaching. When we think of really brilliant work cultures for the last, 30, 40 years or so, Microsoft doesn't come to the top of the list. In fact, many mainstream folks, Simon Sinek among others, have kind of dragged them for their culture or their history of it. But in 2014, a new guy took over as CEO. Satya Nadella took over. And this is a great example of how leadership, one, needs to start at the top. As the CEO, he completely changed the mindset. Andrea said it in her presentation really well, that I don't know mentality or this kind of beginner's mindset. The exact phrasing they adopted at Microsoft is, we went from know-it-all to learn-it-all. We are now operating out of curiosity and discovery. We need to learn it all. We are no longer experts, we are beginners, and we are growing. And that change happened from the top down. And one of the other really interesting things they did is they developed a coaching environment that was really robust. If you're into organizational development, learning models, go check out that story of how they've deployed coaching training. There's a couple of things that I really like that they did, and you're going to hear this from me a lot in the next few minutes. They train constantly. They train all the time on these coaching questions, on this coaching mindset at every level, right? So if you're a frontline employee, you get trained on things that are relevant to you there. If you scale up to a different role or you expand your scope, you get retrained on things consistently in the coaching realm that would apply to you there. They train constantly, and they have an 86% pullback or retention rate in their internal learning system, which across tens of thousands of employees is nuts. Right? So it's one of the biggest things I took away from this is if you don't constantly train what you want to be good at, it won't happen. And when it came to the training and the coaching, there's a couple things I really, really liked that I took away. One, they kept it real. There's no clinical or psychological language in here. They said what they needed to say, and they kept it relevant. The next thing they did is they adopted cohort models. If you're interested in what that kind of looks like, come talk to me. We can nerd out about the cohort learning models, but basically what they did is they kept it relevant for people so they could scale. And if you're sitting here thinking, I don't know how to roll out a really good coaching program, I don't know how to roll out a training program. If Microsoft can do it, you can figure it out, right? But they used a coaching model in cohorts that made it scalable. And the last thing they did, like I said at the beginning, they focused on their environment. Coaching was not something that happened as events popped up. It was something that happened consistently, right? And so we aren't just leaving it up to ad hoc to coach whenever or train whenever. We're doing it consistently. So these are all really good examples, right? But what do we do with this? How do we build it? Where do we start? And I'm going to zoom us way back out. And I want you to start with belief, right? Because we know culture, it's like an ecosystem. We don't affect it in any neutral way. We either contribute to it or we take away from it. We know that culture is driven by behaviors, and behaviors are driven by beliefs. So that's where we have to start. So I want you guys to think about and ask yourselves, what do you believe to be true about the world, your role in it, and your work in it? And I'm going to repeat our belief statement at Think 3D. Again, we believe that we can better the world. It's a lofty goal by improving the way people live, by improving the way people work. We believe that it's important enough to do that work, and it's fundamental enough that it helps shape our culture and how it functions, right? So you guys need to think about, and I honestly would start as you as a person. Team is great, organization is even better, but I would start with you. What do I believe to be true about the world, my role in it, and the work that I'm doing in it, right? What do you think the world needs more of? What are you doing to build something here? What do you believe in that can inform your culture? And based on that, then we get to a point where our culture can have depth. For a long time, before we were talking about organizational development models, when we would talk about culture, we would talk about stories. People would share stories. They were our beliefs. They were our traditions. And I like to talk about culture in terms like that, like story, tradition, myth, lore, right? Your culture should have some depth to it because that's where a lot of that richness lies that I think we're missing when it comes to the employee-employer relationship, right? The only way that we navigate some of the difficulties of employment these days, if we have that richness, if we have that depth. it also should be fun, right? We have a lot of fun at our office. We have goofy things that we've built in to the lore. Manny's got a belt, a big championship belt. And every so often, if he's feeling the energy's getting a little low, he'll kind of parade the belt around and be like, hey, who needs some belt time? You need to hold the belt? You need to grow? You need, to get the energy up a little bit? We have goofy stuff that we do, but it's all part of that lore, right? All of these things we should be figuring out ways to implement this into our culture based on our belief. The next thing that I want you to think about when it comes to building your culture is that your culture needs to be functional. It needs to be functional. I get asked a lot about mission, vision, values. And I honestly, this year alone, I've probably gone through 4 or 5 organizations, and we've started with this process with them. We start with belief, and then based on the belief, we realign or course correct mission, vision, values. And we keep that super simple, but most importantly, we keep it functional. And if you haven't revamped your mission, vision, values right now in this new environment, in this new workforce, in this new market, I would highly encourage you to do so and do it based on the foundation of what you believe. And keep them functional. Your mission, vision, values should be things that don't just look good or sound good. I've had this conversation before where somebody's like, well, I think a lot of people these days value flexibility, so we should put that as one of our values, right? Are you flexible? Then you probably shouldn't put it as one of your values, right? You probably shouldn't do it. You're going to sell people a bill of goods, and that's no way to build culture. So I want you guys to think about these terms and how they function, right? Your mission, vision, values should be functional. They should be impactful. Because when we think about them, we think about statements, right? We think about ideals, values like integrity, teamwork, innovation. He's like, hey, I answer phones for a living. How do I innovate, right? We say these things. So I want you to think about your values differently. I want you to think about your values and how they function. We built something a while ago. We've implemented it with our team in a couple of different iterations, and I've done this with 4 or 5 different organizations this year. We make them a way. Now I can't say, hey, what's the way without a Mandalorian reference or something from Star Wars, but it's the way. It's the Think 3D way, right? And we've built this thing, and what it is a set of functional statements that are impactful to every area of our organization that we feel are non-negotiable. So you're looking at your organization's culture and you're saying, you know what, I believe in this, I think we're good there. We got a really clear mission, we know our objective, we got a really clear vision, we know why we're doing our objective, and we believe in these 5 values. Great, even if you're starting there, you need to start creating a set of behaviors and non-negotiable items so you have that standard to coach to. The reason we do this is because then it influences every stage of our employee experience. That Think 3D way, which is a functional set of expectations, they are dynamic, they're active, you can do them. So have a standard is one of ours. Good enough is not good enough. Be somebody that people want to go through things with. Be kind, be candorous. These are functional statements. They impact every level of my organization, so they scale with me. And they're non-negotiable for us. If you're looking for a way to level up the accountability you have and level up the consistency in your culture, in your communication, in your coaching, you need to figure out what your way is, and you need to tell people. You have to tell people. Your culture does not get created on its own, and it is not something that you get to set and forget. Right? And as you go through this new environment, it's rough out there. It is. And if you're not thinking now about what I'm going to do in the next 12 to 18 months to address staffing, address training, address coaching, it's going to get weird. We see it a lot. We do thousands of hours every year on-site, hands-on with people's organizations, and we know what they're going through. It's going to get weird. So I want you guys to think about how you're doing these things. How do you define and communicate your culture? What are your verticals for doing it? Is it clearly defined? Do you have your behavioral expectations set? Do those behavioral competencies your way? Are they integrated into your performance management system? Are they integrated into your evals? Do you do evals? Do you do evals more than once a year? If you're still doing evals once a year, call me, now. We can talk about it. But where are you defining these things and where are you communicating these things? The next thing I want you to think about is how is the foundation of your team supporting it? Right? You got to build out the foundation to support it. Do we make decisions in a way that actually upholds our culture? Because if you say your culture is X, but our behaviors are Y, we have to readjust. We have to be behaving and making decisions that support our culture. Finally, we have to hold people accountable to it, and we have to create a coaching environment. One of the last things that I'm going to share with you guys, I just want you to think about it. When you think about how to advance your culture, and you think about the opportunities you have in your experience. Example, coaching. Our teams don't coach well. Our teams don't handle conflict well. I always ask people, how often do you train it? Well, everybody goes through the same. No. How often do you train it outside of onboarding? And the answer is rarely more than once. If you are going to build a culture that is functional, if you're going to build a culture that is intentional, you have to train constantly. I have this up there kind of like the first rule of Fight Club, right? The first rule of culture is you have to train constantly. The second rule of culture, you have to train constantly. The third rule of culture, you have to train constantly. In this next era of workforce development and culture, if you are not intentionally training the things that you know you need to be good at, you should have zero expectation that your culture will function. And that's my challenge to you guys, is to go figure out how do we make our cultures and environments function so they serve us and the people that we employ better off. Thanks so much. We'll see you guys next year when I'll check in on culture again. All right?